Hello and welcome to a brand new season of APTN InFocus. I'm your new host, Melissa Ridgen, and today we're putting future Indigenous leaders in focus. What are the priorities and issues for the next generation of Indigenous leaders? If you're a youth watching at home, what should they be? We want you to join into our conversation. Our phone lines are open now. You can call us toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. You can also tweet us at APTN InFocus. We'll be reading some of your tweets later in the show, so get to tweeting. Before I introduce you to our guests, let's set the scene. Leaders.
If we can start to talk to children in society,
Young people who speak to us do not want to be part of a status quo industry. They don't.
There's no shortage of them, and they've got a lot to say. We know who they are, we know what they're doing, we know their causes, we know what they want. But what about the youth leaders? The best and brightest who will lead the Indigenous agenda in the future. What are their priorities? The priorities of the next generation who they represent. The next generation of Indigenous leaders.
For people like my age and younger, it's our future, and not only my future, it's for generations to come.
We still have our heads up high, and we hope to, continue being strong and to overcome, even more obstacles.
After I kind of pushed myself to do something that was a little scary, I guess, after you put yourself into those risks, I feel like you can open up yourself for a whole different opportunities.
The ideas of the future leaders is what we're putting in focus today. So joining us in studio now is Brandon Murdoch. He's from the Fisher River Cree Nation, but grew up in Winnipeg's North End. He was honored as an outstanding Canadian for his outreach work with youth. The award came with a $1,500 prize, which he promptly donated to the Bear Clan Patrol. Brandon is an academic facilitator with CETA Pathways, which helps kids graduate from high school. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Sam Harris. Samantha, you've dedicated your time and energy to working with at-risk youth here in Winnipeg. You're the supervisor of the Crisis Stabilization Unit at Nichuan in Winnipeg and a university student working on your social work degree.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you for joining us. And we have Charlene Moore. She is Cree Soto filmmaker with roots in York Factory. Her film Moccasin Stories challenges stereotypes, oppression, and objectification. And she is currently working on her master's in Indigenous governance at the University of Winnipeg. Correct? Okay, now we will go to Saskatoon. We have Darian Lonechild. She is from the White Bear First Nation and is co-chair of the Assembly of First Nations Youth Council and a youth representative with the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations in Saskatchewan. Darian's in her 4th year of Indigenous Studies and plans to attend law school when she's done. And from Toronto, joining us on Skype, we have Erica Violet Lee. She's a Cree activist, blogger, a grad student in social justice at the University of Toronto. She was a youth delegate for the UN Climate Change Summit in Paris in 2015. Thank you all so much for joining us. And we want to get started with, as a journalist, I want to say, first of all, the media is pretty guilty of putting the microphone in the same faces over and over and over again. And we kind of let them set the agenda for what the topics are. What are we here to talk about all the time? And it's the same stuff and the same people. So thank you for taking time out of your day to come and join us and bring us some fresh perspective here. Okay, I'm going to get started by asking each of you just what would be your top 3 priorities for the national Indigenous agenda, let's call it, so to speak. We put it in quotes because we all know that depending on where you are in Turtle Island, there's different agendas, there's different needs, there's different issues. But what would you say, if you were in charge of leading the charge on the national front, what would your top 3 issues be? And we can get into the meat and potatoes of them after, but I just want to know kind of topically. We'll start with you, Brandon.
Maybe for the youth, I think housing would be a priority for youth. They have some safe, affordable housing options for our youth. That'd be number 1. Number 2, having some mentorship and some employment opportunities. And number 3, just having representation in those opportunities, right? Seeing people from the community and look up to them and be like, I can do that, and I can be that leader, the next leader.
And that's what you're in that line of work right now. You're helping to facilitate that.
For sure.
Sam?
Yes.
Top 3, your wish list.
Top 3. In terms of child and family services, we see a lot of not working with the families. So I think looking at different approaches to the child welfare system and being able to bring in those supports to communities. And then addictions and treatment. I see a lot of barriers and gaps that exist within that system, not only for youth, but also for adults.
Yeah.
So just addressing those kind of issues. And then obviously sexual exploitation is my biggest focus in life right now and what I do in my work. So looking at ending the demand of sexual exploitation and looking at those connections between colonization and exploitation and kind of that history and how that's led to where we are today.
Right. Okay, Charlene. Give us more.
So my focus has always been on education. In Canada, I feel like a lot of people, including our own people, there isn't a lot of education surrounding like our histories, and also just education on reserves are usually lacking. They usually isn't high schools. Kids have to leave to go to school, and that puts them in dangerous situations. And so I feel like there should be more priority put on education for Indigenous communities, but also in our Canadian schools. I also feel like economically that Indigenous peoples need to have more opportunities and own their land the way that they want to own their land, and like pursue economic activities the way that they see fit. And I also feel like we need to take care of our youth the way that you guys are speaking about. I feel like the youth are the future of everything, and we need to focus on them and what they need and what they want in terms of pursuing their goals. So
I like that, and that's why we wanted a youth panel to kick things off. Is what are you guys talking about? What's this generation talking about? What's important, and what can we do to facilitate that? Because you are going to be the next leaders. Now let's go to Darian. Can Darian hear me?
Hi there. Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Darian. I want to know your top 3 priorities. If you were in charge of the national agenda right now, what would be the top 3 things you're pushing?
Okay, wow, the national agenda. I mean, that's such a broad question, but I think some things that I can speak to within my capacity. Number 1, being Indigenous youth suicide, that this needs to be called an epidemic, an epidemic, and that there needs to be it needs to be declared that it's a national state of emergency, and that especially LGBTQ youth as well. Just because Canadian society isn't talking about it doesn't mean that it's not going on, especially in Saskatchewan, in our prairie provinces as well, Inuit youth as well. I think a second priority that I would like to see is engaging young people on this rights and recognition framework, this legal framework that's going on. Young people are so focused on surviving day to day that they don't have the time to engage in government and what is going on above their heads, I guess, especially with their leaders. We as leaders need to engage our young people on this and educate them and take direction from young people, because ultimately this is going to be affecting our future young people as well. And third, I need to see a national strategy that's combating racism, and I think that falls under this is anti-racist education, that this aligns with the justice system and the treatment of Indigenous peoples, and especially young people as well. And so those are 3 main things that have been alarming to me as a young person living day to day, but also as a young leader as well.
I like that. There's a lot in all of these suggestions. Let's go to Erica Violet now. In Toronto. Erica, Violet, what are your top 3?
I find it hard to pick a top 3 because I think it all sort of links back to the same problem we keep dealing with, which is colonialism on our lands. Like the fact that even in order for Canada to exist as a nation, it requires the dispossession of us as Indigenous folks. And as Indigenous youth, as Darian mentioned, especially Two-Spirit, queer, trans, and gender non-binary youth, we rarely have access to the land that we need. We don't have access to food, the most basic things. So like I'm in grad school, and still like most of my focus is spent on survival. So it's a luxury to be in school, but it shouldn't be, because that was something that was like promised in the treaties. something about the foundational documents of this land, right? And so when I think of the inner city, which is where I'm from in Saskatoon, I remember talking to a group of youth at the Core Neighborhood Youth Co-op, and they articulated that the thing that they wanted the most was a 24-hour center in Saskatoon where we could go, a place we can be safe, because in the prairies or in Toronto, wherever you are in this country, there's very few places we can go to be safe, to be welcomed, to be free.
So I guess let's start with, they're all heavy topics. Like, which one do you want to pick at first? Let's start with education. We know that, especially on reserve funding, is chronically underfunded. It's not, you can't even compare people going through, even making it through school on reserve compared to the education that they're going to get off reserve because of the chronic underfunding. It's, where do you start fixing? Where does the problem start being fixed? And I would encourage you all to think about it, jump in. If it's a dialogue. It's not, we don't have to follow a certain script or certain order. It's just, as you think of it, go. So whoever wants to start, I'm curious.
I just think putting the resources into the schools so we can work better with our youth is what we need to be doing. I know Brandon was talking a little bit when we were in the room about what he's doing right now and just getting kids engaged in order to graduate. Mm-hmm. And just graduating alone is something that we don't see happening a lot with our Indigenous youth. And I think that by bringing in those supports, such as Brandon and the work that they're doing, we're able to not only encourage them, but show them the value in education and being able to explain to them that this isn't just a piece of paper you're getting. You're going to be able to do something with your life after you get your education. And just bringing back that focus on the value of education, on the importance of learning about things and learning about your culture and your identity and how that can bring you to whatever you're going to do with your life.
Well, and that education is your ticket to freedom from whatever you might feel is your situation that you're not happy in, the poverty, overcrowding, all of these things that make the day-to-day hard and lead to the suicide that we were just talking about. That education is a ticket out of so much, and just to get kids to understand that. I'm curious how many of you went through school and have seen your friends, your peers, just get lost in that abyss.
Yeah, well, for sure, because I like what she said too, like in the education system up north too, right? We just need, I guess our youth just needs some better direction, some better guidance, because there's not really, the resources are lacking. Mm-hmm. So like I remember going up north to do a basketball clinic for the youth, right? Up in Shmadwa in like 2012. Like just that one little gesture was huge for the community, right? Mm-hmm. I think the high school went up to grade 10. So then the kids had ambitions, be like, I want to go and graduate, right? I want to graduate to go to the University of Winnipeg to play College Westman, right? So just these little acts, right? And just sports is that connection that the kids got, arts, it's not through sports, it can be arts, anything, right? It can be very affordable, right? It doesn't have to be these huge expensive stuff, right? We can, when we get educated, right, we should hopefully go back to our communities and go and show our youth that, we came from these communities, and go back to show them our success stories and show them that, we made it and that they're resilient and they're able to make it too, because they're surviving day to day.
Are you seeing enough of that? Are we seeing enough of people taking their successes and going back to the communities to say, here's where I am, here's where I came from, and here's how I got from A to B? Are we seeing enough of that? Is that part of the problem, or is that helping?
I think you're seeing a lot more of that. I know I've seen a lot of that just within some of the communities that I've been able to go to and do events. So I have seen an increase in that, but it's not enough, right? We still need more people to be going back into their communities and bringing those supports and bringing those positive stories about how they've been able to turn their life around or take back control of their life in whatever aspect. I think that we need to do more of that and go back into our communities, because again, like you said, like our youth are our future, and if we're not engaging them and getting them excited about their future, we're not going to have a very great future, I don't think.
Yeah.
So just bringing that back to the community is really important, to go back in and say, like, this is what I'm doing with my life, and this is how I was able to, take back control and do all the things that I want to do.
Yeah. Darian, do you have something you'd like to add about engaging Indigenous youth to finish high school, to move on above and beyond high school, to get their secondary degrees and further?
Mm-hmm.
What's the solution?
For sure. I mean, right now here I'm sitting in the Gordon Oaks at the University of Saskatchewan, and I think that there needs to be a very strong commitment from our universities to accommodate and to empower Indigenous youth with their languages, with their ceremonies, things that also remind them of home, that make them feel home in an institution that they're learning. I know that this Gordon Oaks building has been a huge accomplishment for our Indigenous students here at the U of S. And so this is a great example of engaging young people, engaging young Indigenous youth to be more present and take charge of their education as well. And so I think having commitment from our universities across the country to provide safe spaces for Indigenous youth is really important, and I think that would lead to a lot more engagement as well. The incorporation of our languages and our identities are so crucial to not only our mental health, but to our self-esteem and how we feel and move about in the world as well.
We've got our panelists
provides
here
us
all
with motivation. Awesome. It provides us with motivation to go back to our communities and to make a difference, to go back and talk with our elders, you know, create a positive future for our communities and our lands in which we are walking upon and we have to be stewards of. So,
Erica, what needs to be done in terms of education for this generation to make a difference?
So as a grad student, I have dealt with the question like my whole entire career, like the 24 years I've been in school. Basically, people thinking that we get a free ride, that we somehow get something easy. It's true. The same thing as with status cards or with the treaties. The common conception is that we get things for free and we get them for easily. But I know for a fact that I was lucky to go to school at the University of Saskatchewan with the Indigenous Studies department being as strong as it was. And I was reluctant to join the Indigenous Studies department because I thought that seemed like a less rigorous space. But in reality, it was exactly what I needed because it's a department that is telling you while you're in this building, when you get your education, and while you're getting your education, there's a community outside you're still accountable to. And that's the thing too, is I don't want us to get so wrapped up in educational spaces that are run by the Canadian state that we also like let Trudeau and Canada keep having possession of all of our land. And I think everyone on this panel knows that.
Well, and an interesting point that you made was about education, and maybe part of I'm not sure if that will fit within the education umbrella or the national racism strategy umbrella, but we need to be educating Canadians certainly about this myth to this free ride that we all get. We pay no taxes, we don't pay tuition, we have this free ride that's we could talk about that when we get to back to the topic about the national racism strategy. Okay, so I would be curious now to think, I know a lot of you are actively involved in environmental issues. And I know just from people that I know that are youth, talking to them, that this is a huge issue for them. They think that the environment is not high enough on anybody's agenda, including our Indigenous leaders of today, certainly not the Canadian government. I think you could argue even us as consumers, it's not high enough on our priority, what we're buying and what impact it's having on this planet, this earth. I'd like to hear from a couple of you. What's the answer? What do we do to fix this lack of attention that exists on our environment, on our planet, on our Mother Earth?
Well, I guess like the youth panel, the focus is to educate our youth to lead the way, because if we're not educating the youth, you know, they don't know, they're not aware of what they're doing to the planet. So we got to make sure we educate our youth. And I remember when the Winnipeg did the DPL protest, there was lots of youth that were protesting that, you know, water is life, singing the drums. So, you know, there's lots of youth involved in that, right? So you can see the generations that it passed on, right? And the importance of just water, and like, you know, like we should be grateful that we get clean water, and like, you know, and we teach, there's so much teachings around water, and then we should pass that on to not only Indigenous people, but non-Indigenous people, because like the water dance, the water ceremony, it's very, very traditional, and it's very sacred, and it's honorary, right? Because without water, there's no life.
And then connect the threat, I mean, how we're living, how we're existing now, the threat that poses
Definitely.
this. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back and we're going to keep talking environment because that's an important one. I think everybody seems to agree. So we have much more to come in addition to the environmental stuff. So stay with us. We'll be right back. Join our conversation now. You can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Hello, welcome back. In case you're just joining us now, today we are putting future Indigenous leaders in focus. If they were leading the Indigenous agenda on the national stage today, what would their priorities be? Let's go to social media now and see what some people have to say when they weigh in on this. We've got Brad LaValle. First thing I would do is fire all of these leaders we have now who are so out of touch with real life we live every day and stuck in the 20th century. That was on Twitter. We've got TJ Player who says, we need more youth counselors and mental health awareness, but not just the Western psychologists. Elders and other Indigenous youth open the door between these generations. And we've got Clint on Facebook. Pretty simple, unity. If you would like to add your opinion to our topic of conversation, here's how you can do that. Now, you can call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like and watch us live on the APTN News Facebook page. Follow and tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts in an email to infocus@aptn.ca. Hello. Hello. I'd like to go to Erica now just to finish. We started talking just before the break about the environment as a priority. Erica's done a lot of work with climate. Let's go to her and see what she has to think would be some potential solutions to the problem that we face with the lack of vision, I guess, on our climate policies in this country.
I don't even know if it's a lack of vision at this point. And I think about this too when folks think we just need, they need more education. If Justin Trudeau actually read a book like Chelsea Vowell's Indigenous Rights or Tracy Lindbergh's Birdie or any number of youth Indigenous works that have been written, maybe if they had that education, they would do something differently. And I don't know if I believe that anymore. Having been at the climate conference, the UN climate conference in Paris, this is in 2015, nothing has changed since then. I think fundamentally it's a worldview difference. If you're not out on the land, and by out on the land, I mean even in the city, and recognizing that this is what our life depends on, and folks are actively destroying it, and we know their names. And we know the names of their corporations. We know the addresses. That's what I think is going to make a difference. And we don't have to convince everyone. Right? If we waited to get everyone on board to save the planet, we're not going to get it done in time.
I've always kind of wondered if it's easier to get, instead of getting political change to this effect, if it's easier to start with your neighbor, your neighbor's neighbor, your mother, your grandmother, and just the way that we consume the things that we think nothing of going to a dollar type store, for example, and filling 6 bags for a kid's of plastic for a kid's birthday party, and where does that go? I don't know that the government can fix that thinking, can govern against us going and buying 6 bags of plastic crap that we don't need. Anybody have thoughts about getting people? It's the consumers. What if we started there? Politicians haven't made the necessary changes yet, so let's approach it from the other way. I'd like to hear what you think. Charlie, go.
Well, I do agree that consumers, obviously the market goes according to what the consumers want, and whatever consumers buy, the market will keep supplying that. And so that makes sense that consumers need to think about what they're buying and try and be a bit more conscious. But it's also difficult, especially for us, like living in northern Indigenous communities, that we don't really have access to like the same things that everybody else does, or even just living in the city. It's way more expensive to try and buy like organic, like vegetables and fruits than to buy like a can of vegetables. So it's difficult to try to reconcile that. But my main thing is that if Indigenous peoples were able to be more sovereign in their communities, to have more control over their lands and over the way that they develop economically, then we will see a lot of more sustainable ways of creating energy, and like possibly being able to go back to our traditions of like eating off the land, and sort of supporting that in a more like traditional sense, and also like a logical sense for these communities.
Darian, I'd like to go to you now, because you had mentioned something that fascinated me when we spoke on the phone about this national racism. What did you call it? National racism strategy.
A national strategy, to combat racism.
I want to know all about it.
Yeah, totally, sure. Well, I mean, it'll go back to education. Just myself, pursuing my education has definitely opened my eyes onto the possibilities of what we really can do alongside Canada to get rid of this issue. I can't say that people who tell me their day-to-day experiences and stories of facing racism on the street, I can't say that they're liars. I have to believe the experiences that are constantly shared, like on Facebook. Hate speech is the norm that we see on Facebook. Comment sections of news articles that are about Indigenous issues. It's an issue, and I think that education is the tool to combat this, and that there needs to be a strategy put in place to incorporate anti-racist education from K to 12s. It needs to start now, because we're constantly living with this. We're working in a system, 150 plus years of racism that's been interwoven. Racism is interwoven into Canadian society. We cannot deny that. And there has to be a commitment to combat this and to put an end to this. If we want to talk about, the most important relationship with Indigenous peoples, well, let's do that for Indigenous youth, for non-Indigenous youth, that they need to learn that they cannot hold cultural biases against Indigenous people.
And it starts with not just people who are born and raised here, but we're seeing this with new Canadians as well, which will be something that we'll be discussing at a later InFocus. Let's talk about justice reform. Who wants to start?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I'll quickly weigh in, I guess. Because I come from the prairie provinces here in Saskatchewan, we are all familiar with Colton Bushy and what happened there. And I think the treatment of his family was unacceptable, and this goes back to the national strategy to racism. Is that was a perfect example of how it's within our justice system. If we saw justice reform, it would look much differently for Indigenous peoples. I mean, incarceration rates wouldn't be so high, and young people wouldn't feel scared walking down the street with being followed or targeted by police officers. There's a lot of things that we need to see change, and that needs to come with justice reform.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that topic, justice reform, overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prison?
Yeah, for sure, because with this huge overrepresentation in prisons with Indigenous people, it's like there's a huge, with such a low percentage, right, 3% in Canadian population, but we're like 75, 80% in these institutions. So there's definitely systemic racism plagued in this system, in this justice system, right, against Indigenous people. So, there's more transition to, more cultural and language-based programs to help them transition. So I think if we can help these people, the people in the prison system, to help find their language, help find their culture, maybe there's a more higher success rate for a lower recidivism rate, right? So, they just need to get on the red road and just try to find the right path for their life, and just,
That's exactly, I had interviewed a gentleman who works with offenders when they are released, and he says you don't see much in terms of recidivism among these people. who've spent a long time in prison a lot of times. We're not talking light, 2-3 months in jail. We're talking like long-term prison sentences. They come out. You don't see much in terms of recidivism. If you can get these people trained to do jobs, have meaningful jobs and work, and be pulling in paychecks. So that could go back to education and training as well.
Well, and I think that these issues often start when they're youth. So me on the front lines working with youth, we're seeing the justice cycle starts very early, where they're set up for these crazy conditions that they can't meet them. They can't meet these expectations, and so they fall in this cycle, and they're back and forth between the justice system and coming back into the units and things like that. And then that just repeats until they're 18. And then once they're 18, they have no life skills. They haven't learned how to get their education. They haven't learned who they are as a person. And so then that just continues to carry on into their life as an adult. And then we're seeing that these cycles are continuing on. And we're not looking at, if we look at when they're youth and start to address those issues of identity and who they are and finding culture and bringing that back to them as a youth, we can maybe stop that cycle before they turn 18 and end up in the adult justice system.
The other thing that too is that once you are in that system, if you are Indigenous, you will be treated differently in that system than you will be for non-Indigenous offenders. You will get, we know this, you will get longer sentences. You will have a way higher rate of convictions. And once you're in that system, so does anybody have any idea? I mean, what do we do? It's one thing to address it as let's keep our kids, our people out of the system to divert them somewhere else. But what about in the system? What do you do to, I don't know, whose area of expertise is this? They're in the system. What do you do to keep them, I guess, not being chewed up into the system? We've got this. I mean, the rates of solitary confinement is an issue. It's higher for especially Indigenous women.
I guess the conditions in our institutions are very inhumane. There's overpopulation. There's so the solitary. It's very, very difficult for people to transition to Canadian society after living this institutionalized lifestyle for a long time, and and then the youth that I went to a youth center too in Brandon, right? And then there's a bunch of youth that were set up to TP that started the Sacred Fire, and it was all hosted by an elder, right? So all of these kids were in for some really serious crimes, but they found who they were through that lifestyle, and they said that these kids usually change their lifestyle, and I think that there's so much stigma when the offenders come out of jail also. They can't get jobs, they can't find decent employment rates. So like what she said, it's just back into the cycle. So, it starts with also in this, trying to train them to get employment opportunities outside of the system, right? So that could be their GED, that could be life skills, that could be doing your taxes, that could be doing a resume, something like that. And
well, one could argue those should be things that we could be doing while they're in those facilities serving their time, right? So you're kind of prepped when you come out. Erica, I'm wondering if you have anything you would like to weigh in on the justice reform.
Absolutely. So I'm from the same place as Darien, Saskatchewan, and we both have worked a lot with the Bougie family, and just recognizing the way that the entire case was done incorrectly. And this is not a new thing. The police violence that we face is not a new thing. Right now, I don't even remember the stats because it's almost 100% of youth in prison and in institution incarceration in Saskatchewan are Indigenous, like almost 100%. And so when I see that statistic and I hear that statistic, I know that doesn't mean that all Indigenous people are criminals. It means that the system is set up to put us in jail. It means that it's set up to take us straight out of our families into childcare, whether it's a social worker or a police officer, or teachers too. Teachers have a role to play in this.
Yeah.
And I think too of it's not just Fulton Bushy, even though that story got a ton of coverage because we worked so hard on it. I'm thinking too of Jordan LaFond, a young person who was just recently killed in Saskatoon this summer by the police. I'm thinking of Ava Taysap, Shalina Probe, and Kalinda Waterhen, who are 3 Native women who went missing and ended up killed in my neighborhood of Westside Saskatoon. And I think of the Saskatoon police even going into Wikipedia and trying to erase Starlight Tours from the section, not realizing there's a record of that. Not only an online record, but a record in our minds, because, you know, Canada's been here for 150 years, but our memories are a lot longer than that, and we'll remember for a lot longer than this.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we'll take this opportunity for a quick break. We'll come back. We'll see what's happening on our Facebook. We aren't done talking to the youth leaders about where the Indigenous agenda should be going. Stay with us. And welcome back. We have been talking to youth leaders about what's important to them and their peers. We've had many ideas and discussions discussed here already, but we want to get to something that's in the news now. The new Indigenous rights framework the federal government is working on right now. This legislation will make changes to the current way that First Nations and the Canadian government deal with each other. I want to know how you feel about what's in the legislation and the process in which it was drafted. Who wants to go first?
The framework will remove barriers for Indigenous people to support their self-determination aspiration through both law and policy. It'll support a distinctions-based approach for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, advance the implementation of treaties and agreements, support new approaches to the evolution of treaties and agreements, and keep the Government of Canada accountable.
They're saying we're going to define our rights ourselves and implement them, but it's relying on Crown approval and discretion to do that. And many of the nations are saying we do not need your approval to exercise our recognition and our rights and our title, and we're sovereign. And I think that's where the basis is going back to, is our inherent title and rights and our sovereignty. Canada still isn't acknowledging that.
If they have the political will to do something, we can get it done. We have the political will on our side of the table to be able to move forward on a positive, constructive basis, because what this is attempting to change is changing it forever. We'll never get another shot at being able to change something in the context of where they're going right now.
So I'll start with Darian on this, because I know this is something we'd had a chat about this framework. Darian, let's hear your thoughts.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll say that nobody knows what's going on the ground. Even just as a youth leader, I've had to do my own educating myself and watch the news on what's going on. Young people don't know about the framework, first of all. What are we doing as leaders to ensure that our young people know about this framework, what it entails, and what is this going to mean for the future of us? I haven't seen a whole lot done I don't think I've seen anything done by the minister or our own leaders to bring youth into the conversation. I know that there was a forum held at AFN and that none of our members from the Youth Council were able to be supported to come and bring some insight and some advice, I guess, and some direction to our First Nations leaders. I know that teach-ins are held by organizations, grassroots organizations, to educate the public on what is going on, but I don't see our leaders bringing this to our communities and to our young people as well. You know, especially to do with our treaty rights. We're treaty youth here in Saskatchewan, and we are very concerned. I'm concerned about what it means for the future of young people, treaty youth.
When you hear people talking about, and it's talking above people for the most part. It's vapid gov speak. It's leaders saying this, using the same lingo over and over and over again. And do you get a sense that they do that because they don't want people to understand what they're up to?
Definitely, I think that's totally what's going on. But I also have the question: if we're looking for nation-to-nation relationships, how come we haven't written this legislative framework ourselves? How come we haven't been given the space or tools to determine this ourselves, and rather than the Crown determining what our rights are, what this framework is going to look like, and how it's going to dictate us, I would say.
Well, and any
I think we
panelist
deserve that.
Could jump in on this. You know, how do you get in on it? How do you say, what do you do? Do you go to your leaders and say, we want in on this discussion? This is something, this framework is if it goes through, is saddling my generation with stuff that we don't even understand because you haven't involved us. You're not speaking in a language anybody outside of your small table speaks. And that's how it gets with people involved in politics. What's the plan to mobilize, I guess, then?
Well, unfortunately, in like the neighborhood I work in, right, the inner city of North End, it's like, that's not the discussions that's happening, right?
No.
So, these issues are not the top priorities for our youth in the inner city. So, that's a big barrier for our kids, right? Is, being disengaged not only from, the treaty talks and the treaty rights, but also just like politics and, like who's governing our city, who's governing our province, who's governing Canada, right? We're not discussing these, and it's totally disconnected from our families, and we're not eating dinner talking about this stuff, and, it's
There's too much else on the go. Yeah. Erica, I mean, you know how to mobilize. What are your thoughts on getting youth involved in this framework discussion?
So often still Canada, reconciliation era Canada is so wrapped up in this idea of Native trauma, of Indigenous trauma and damage. Like we're the damaged ones. We're the ones that need healing. We're the ones that need fixing and civilizing. Basically, it's a new way of saying we as a project still aren't done. And I want to like flip that and say, actually, like it's the colonial framework that causes damage, that is damaged. It's colonized folks and folks who are complicit in colonization, who are damaged and need healing. But I want to move away from the idea of damage for Indigenous folk. We see Prime Minister Trudeau, and he loves to take his selfies, and he loves to talk about inclusion and unity for the cameras. And I think Darian made an important point when she mentioned anti-racism. Because so often, Canada would love us if we were powwow dancing when and where they told us to. If we're being joyful and happy and not confrontational when and where they tell us to. And so our sovereignty is always, we're told that our sovereignty has to exist within the framework of Canada, and that's not true. We've been here like before Canada, way before Canada, and we'll be here after Canada is, after Canada crumbles, because concrete parliaments are much weaker buildings than teepees are.
Well, there's a lot of leaders who disagree, saying, yeah, this framework is a good idea, and we should work with Canada on it. And I think that there's, from what I'm hearing from the panelists, youth aren't necessarily sure which side to fall on. It's like I don't understand what's at stake, what they're talking about, how they arrived at this. Darian, you're very politically active. What's the solution to this? How do we get youth to A, understand what this is all about, and B, weigh in with their thoughts and concerns?
It falls on our leaders. It falls on our chiefs. It falls on the minister and also the prime minister to create that space, to host events where young people can actually come bring their concerns to the table, first of all, and also be taught about what this framework entails. And be a part of the decision-making process. I think that definitely falls on our own chiefs, though. And definitely myself as a youth leader too, as I'm doing right now, is talking about this framework. It definitely, right now, I need to see it from leadership, making that first step to include young people in on it.
Is there an interest among young people to get into politics? Do you see like the grassroots? You guys work with grassroots people who've got a lot on the go in a lot of cases. Do you see, I mean, politics might be a stretch from where their next step is, but you have a lot of people that are active as well. Do you see interest in getting into the politics of all of it?
I do think that there's an increase in youth getting involved in politics. I mean, we see our neighbors down south. There's a huge push right now for youth to be involved in voting and getting involved in the political scene. And I think we are seeing that here as well, where we're seeing our youth starting to step up and learning more about politics and figuring out where they stand on things. I just think that the biggest thing is, like you said, language, right? We use this big language that is colonial and it's made by the government, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to someone. I'm an adult and I sometimes don't understand some of the things that are being said.
Yeah.
I think that if we start to bring the youth in and start letting them know in their own languages and letting them know in their own kind of context what their role is in this, in our society and in our future, I think that we have to realize that they're our leaders. They're the ones that are going to be taking over eventually, right? And that time is coming a lot sooner than we realize. And so we, again, need to give that safe space for them to be able to step up as leaders and take over the politics. I think that's where the real change is going to happen, is by bringing those kids in and having them use their voices instead of adults.
I like that. We have a caller we can go to who's talking on exactly this.
Hi
we
there.
have Andre from Saskatoon.
Hi there.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for joining us.
I'm great. So I wanted to make a quick comment on the discussion of the framework agreement. So I have been doing independent advising for Minister Bennett for TRC 66. One of those areas, I was advised by one of her staff to speak in our communities about the framework agreement. And so the first thing that I asked was I sent 3 questions to the minister's office to be answered about the framework agreement. So the first question was, how do we ensure this engagement discussion guide itself is developed and administered by Indigenous people? The second question is, how do we know Indigenous people are going to be the ones taking that feedback, reviewing it, so nothing gets lost in translation from non-Indigenous perspectives? And the third question was, how can the Canadian government ensure Indigenous peoples have agreed to this specific engagement process determining our rights? And so those 3 questions, the minister's office, the federal government still needs to answer to our people. They haven't answered it to me when they asked me to talk to our young people in our communities about the framework. And so they still need to answer to this country and to Indigenous people those 3 specific questions.
Did you get this sense that the questions maybe set them back a bit? They were hoping for something a little fluffier?
Well, I didn't get a reply yet, so...
You sent them scrambling.
I think our Indigenous people in this country still need answers to those essential questions in regards to the framework, absolutely, without a doubt.
So what are you going to do now? I mean, you've thrown the questions out there. Are you just going to sit and wait for answers, or do you have a...
Absolutely not. The nationhood of and mobilization of our Indigenous youth has to start now. It has to start today. It starts with educating our young people, collectively rounding young people up and teaching them about our ceremonies, our governance, our treaties, our language, and having our own young people self-sufficient in their knowledge and understanding to determine our own nationhood. That's our job. It's not the job of the Canadian government to tell us who we are.
Andre, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks. I appreciate your comments on that topic.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too. So let's get to, we don't have to name names. We're not here to pick on people. Unless you feel like picking on people, then pick on them all you want, because I don't have a problem with that. Because people are leaders, and they should be, when you put your name forward, you should be up for some smackdowns if you deserve them. I'd like to hear from each of you what you think about the quality of leaders that we currently have. At the local, at the band level, urban Indigenous leaders, provincial Indigenous leaders, national Indigenous leaders, right up to AFN, our leaders that we have sitting in the House of Commons. How do you feel that they're doing in promoting or representing Indigenous people?
Yeah, well, to add on to your other comment about having young people engaged in politics, I feel it's happening also because locally, especially in the North End, having the representation of Kevin Chief in the Point Douglas constituency, Bernadette Smith currently as the current MLA, having diversity in the MLA party, right? So there is that representation. So there is hope for me that I see, the diversity and hopefully in more parties, and and the young people too, right? More young people got more the highest turnout rates in the inner city in the North End because of representation in our politics, right? So I believe that we're going to have better representations in politics, and we're going to see solutions, and that's at the end of the day, that's what we're going to need to do, right? We're going to need our leaders to step up at the political table, and at the end of the day, we need to vote for them, right? In Winnipeg, we're the largest Indigenous population, right? We can have political power in our civil elections.
And it's good to see that it is growing here, or locally in Winnipeg anyways. But what about the guys who are already, we've got AFN, who deals directly with this government. How are they doing?
I'm not going to speak to specifically AFN, but in terms of government, I don't think there's enough Indigenous representation. I don't think that they're doing enough to raise that. The provincial government, I think, is taking away a lot of money for places that need it the most. I see a lot of financial cuts being made within the child welfare system, which is a huge, huge concern. These are our most vulnerable people that need the funding. We need to be able to do the work that we're doing and continue to do that work. And without that funding and without the support from the government, we can't do that work, and we can't continue to do the good work that we're doing. It's becoming, people are fighting for that money, right? You've got a lot of organizations that are working with youth, and it's coming down to, this is a pile of money and you better get what you can out of it. And that's ridiculous.
So the leaders should stop being cheap.
Yeah, we put a lot of money into a lot of things that we don't really need in this city, and I don't think we put enough money into the things that we do need to put money into.
Charlene, what are your thoughts? We're getting short on time here, so I'll ask you to keep things short and sweet, but current leaders, how are they doing?
Well, I think, first of all, our government is a colonial government, and that's a huge issue that we're stemming from. But another thing is that there's not a lot of women representation in government, and I feel like for so long, women have been oppressed, specifically within our Indigenous communities, from an outside, like the Western government oppressing women, not allowing them to be involved in politics. That has really hurt our communities, and I believe that moving forward, that women should have a stronger stance in government.
We've got a couple, well, maybe a minute left. Darian, Erica, which one would like to take a stab at this one? How are the current leaders doing? We're talking from the Band Council to the Prime Minister's office.
Yep. Sure. Well, I mean, I can see that we're in a difficult time right now. Our leaders are no different from all our people on the ground who are going through intergenerational trauma. We're subject to poverty, to violence, just as the people in our communities as leaders, and I think that has reflected in our governance, and especially lateral violence that we can definitely see at band council systems and also regional governments. And I think that's an issue that we have to tackle by coming together, unifying ourselves and looking at ourselves and saying, hey, we have personal work to do. And our people's rights are on the line, and we need to collectively get together right now and ensure that we're working together in a respectful way, in a good way, as we would say.
Erica, I'm going to give you the very last of the last. We've got shreds of time left. Go, Erica.
The leaders that I see and care about the most are the young people around me, the young, queer, two-spirit, trans, Indigenous, Black folks, migrant folks of color, all across this land who recognize it as a colonial construct and realize that we actually have the framework for so many better things already existing in our teachings. So I'm thankful for those leaders.
Thank you. This is all the time that we have for today, our very first In Focus of this season. We are going to be back next week to put a new topic in focus. The episode will be available for download or podcast on our website, aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Thanks so much for joining us. We will see you back here next week.